Welcome to another edition of the Mail Time Podcast. I'm joined today by Middle East analyst at JPost, Seth Frantzman. I've known Seth for quite some time now, and it's an honor to welcome you back, Seth. So thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I think we're both New Englanders originally, and a bit contrarian, so we get along rather nicely. I want to start with a Facebook post from Eyal Eshel, the father of the murdered soldier Roni Eshel. She fell at the Nahal Oz base on October 7th. And I want to read, it's slightly lengthy, but I want to read it just to frame the conversation. We can get into what happened with Iran and what's going on in Gaza. The title of the last few hours is A Historic Night, one that came at the cost of my daughter, at the cost of our childhood lives. In recent days, the conversation around the hostages has been almost completely silenced. A historic night, we've already said. Now everyone who abandoned my daughter, all of them, are heroes. All the fallen on October 7th will grow even more silent, and that is what I fear. The conversation has vanished, while the IDF officers responsible for that Black Saturday are being praised once again this morning for nothing. If October 7th hadn't erupted the way it did, no one would have dared to attack like this in Gaza or in Lebanon, certainly not in Iran. Remember this well, because of them, there will be silence for years. Unfortunately, because of them, not because of the so-called, quote-unquote, personal price paid in Netanyahu's house, we paid the highest price. October 7th was negligence and a deliberate failure, and no one should think otherwise. The day gave permission in the months since to go wild, to bomb all our enemies. Great, but all of it could have been avoided had there been any forethought, a reading of the data, and attention to the mountain of intelligence that had accumulated over the years. How did the army prepare forward operating bases deep inside Iran, yet fail to close the hole in the southwest wall of the Nahal Oz base? I'll end there. He said a lot more there, but what's your initial takeaway from that and what we've seen in Iran versus the complete lack of preparedness on October 7th?
Well, I think that's, it's largely correct that Israel spent, a number of years focused on what, people thought was the more important enemy, which is the Iranian threat, which they called the third circle threat. They even devoted a whole staff officer to it and a lot of resources. And I think at some point, there was even publicly someone had said something like, well, 90% of the effort or intelligence or whatever the focus is on the north. We got, basically they were saying for years, Hamas is a joke. It doesn't matter. It's defeated. It's deterred. So that was the way in which they viewed that, and they totally underestimated the Hamas enemy. Now, look, in history, people underestimate and get things wrong, or they get timing wrong, like Battle of Pearl Harbor or Tet Offensive or whatever. But the difference on October 7th is, Hamas was not some far off thing like Japan bombing Pearl Harbor. It was a known enemy that was literally a meter from the border, 30,000 enemy fighters, in which they practiced every day to kill Jews, and which they had already massacred hundreds of people in the 90s and 2000s. So this wasn't like some new thing, like we don't know what it is. It was very well known what it was capable of. And, there was an extreme dereliction in terms of not bothering to devote basically any resources to the border. I mean, it's one thing to take back all the human intelligence assets from inside Gaza, which is what happened. It's another thing to underestimate them. But it's a third thing, as he mentioned, to just say, yeah, but what about your own base? I mean, how about, just having the correct security, having the basic things you would expect of a military organization to do. And those basic things were not done. And leaving the border with a few hundred soldiers to face 30,000 of the enemy, is just extremely, there's so many words you could say: incompetence, arrogance, terrible things. It should be investigated fully, and that people have not been held to account for it. Now, it's not a zero-sum game. Either you fight Iran or Hamas. This is the Jewish people. It's Israel, right? And historically, the people ran Israel. Ben Gurion or Menachem Begin or Arik Sharon or the pre-state Haganah Underground, and the Irgun and Lehi. These guys and women, they didn't just say, okay, we just want to defend one little area. They all understood that there's a lot of enemies. You have to fight them all.
How are we to understand the success of Israel's mission in Iran? How do you see it?
Well, it's a mission Israel obviously prepared for, for 20 years or so. Obviously, things have changed in the last few years. Israel received more F-35s. Israeli air defenses increased a lot in the last several years. It's important to remember that the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 system, which had been developed since the 80s, the Arrow system itself, but the 2 and the 3, the new ones, they came online operational within the last war, since October 2023. So, those interceptors proved themselves, and Israel built up a stockpile of them. Also, David Sling, it proved itself. It's being sold to Finland. It can also be used apparently against ballistic missiles, and I believe even Iron Dome was actually used. It's not been publicly explained, but I think they did try to use it. So, and also the Barak systems that are also a naval system. It's an air defense system. So, Israel just has a plethora of systems now, and it didn't have as many of them before. So, you have the technology, you have the systems, and you have a window of opportunity with the Trump administration in office. Trump administration says 60 days or whatever to negotiate. The Iranians drop the ball. There's like this weird window of opportunity to pull the trigger, and also the Hezbollah and the proxies are weakened, and the Assad regime is gone, which takes away the Iranian pawns on the board and opens up an avenue right to the Iranian king. So that is it's a huge window, and Israel basically had the plans, I think, and just had to pull the trigger on them, and had been training for this. And it's it's what Israel waited for a very long time. And I think many Israelis, at least people who bother to watch the news, were waiting for this day for 15 years, since the
Were,
Bush era.
Seth, are you surprised that Bibi actually had the courage to go ahead and with this operation?
Yeah, I think that Netanyahu's been in charge for a very long time in Israel, and the reputation is that he's risk adverse. So even though he was the person that was talking most about the Iranian threat, and obviously, under his tenure, various chiefs of staff came and went and prepared for this for a long time. I think that the willingness to do this was a surprise. And I think that nevertheless, once the ducks were in order, it was possible to pull that trigger. And I think the story is that I think Netanyahu has pushed for this before. So it's not like he didn't push for it. He was considered the main Iran guy. It was always just a question is, okay, so when do we go? We in terms of Israel. And I think that was always the question, to line up all the things that had to be lined up so that any questions of the risk averse aspect would be like, no, it's fine, as opposed to, well, let's just take a huge gamble, which I think he is not known for. So yeah, that they all came together. But he was messaging about this, and I think there was a sense, if you read leaked reports for the last year, that Israel was pushing for this.
Do you think it would have been possible with Yoav Galant as the Minister of Defense? My understanding is the relationship really wasn't so great. And it seems to me that the operational security involved to keep this thing pretty airtight indicated a lot of coordination. Do you share that belief, or do you think that regardless they would have been able to get through it?
It's hard to say. I mean, one of the issues Netanyahu has always had is he doesn't actually get along with people that are former generals or experts, or more experts than he himself is, when they're in positions near him. So what I mean is, Yoav Galant was a skilled general, and then he was raised to be he ended up being defense minister, so in the cabinet. And then you had the same problem with Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, who had been chief of staff and held every other position in the army. Apparently, he also did. They all have a falling out. Netanyahu seems to have had a falling out with most of these security heavyweights he's worked with, right? So that's the usual model. And so that would tend to mitigate against bold actions in war, because these guys either personally don't get along with him, or just on professional aspects disagree with him. So it does seem that having an Israel Katz, who is a politician, as a defense minister, not a former general, probably streamlined this and made this a lot easier, because Katz has been in office for around 7 months or so, not that long. So
Right, and I think the understanding was basically Israel Katz was there to do Bibi's bidding, so um, he's not really going to break from what Bibi has in mind. Do you think the ceasefire lasts?
the one with Iran that is just new. I think it may last, but let's remember, what is a ceasefire. There is a quote unquote ceasefire with Lebanon, and Hezbollah is part of that ostensibly. Now, Israel has carried out I don't know, hundreds of airstrikes since that ceasefire. Hezbollah has responded not at all. So is that a ceasefire? Is it working? It works for Israel. It doesn't work for Hezbollah very well. That could be the model with Iran, which is that, Israel feels it has more freedom of action, and therefore if Iran decides to start moving some, what do they call them? All this enrichment stuff, or whatever, these centrifuges from Natanz to Isfahan, and the truck that's driving them suddenly just just blows up. I mean, trucks blow up all the time, so you can't know when a truck could fail. So the brakes fail. So then Israel feels that it has more ability to just do things like that, but not necessarily take credit for them. And the Iranians have to then kind of take it, because they have to be able to pretend plausible deniability. Well, no, nothing happened. That, you never know. Or does it just completely fall apart, like the Gaza ceasefire? Because Israel says, hey, the Iranians are still enriching. Hello, they didn't get a deal. There's no deal. We have to go back.
Well, turning to Gaza for a second, how do you evaluate the current state of the war? Do you think that the Gideons Chariots has been successful mission-wise? And if so, what it actually is the mission?
Well, Gideons Chariots was approved, I believe, in early May. And it was ostensibly a new operation that, if you read the reports of what it was, sounded like kind of great in a sense, because it sounded like, okay, all of 2004, whatever the IDF did, going in and out, clearing neighborhoods, leaving, clearing, going back, the IDF's going to take all that tactic, which everyone seems to agree didn't really work and didn't defeat Hamas and did not bring hostages home, by the way, at all, because the deal that was done in January had nothing to do with what happened in 2024. Take all that, pretend it never happened. Start all over with a whole new concept. Go into Gaza, conquer it street by street by street. Totally remove Hamas from everything you can. Hopefully get the hostages back eventually, and just totally, well, in the words of some politicians, totally destroy Gaza or lead people to leave. Now, that doesn't seem very moral, of course, just destroying things for the heck of it, or displacing millions of people. That's not nice. So that would not be nice. But in terms of the military aspect, at least doing something that seemed to be decisive. Now, that was the story. Then it didn't happen. Then everyone waited for it to happen. They called up all these reservists and they didn't do anything. Then it finally started in like mid-May, and 5 divisions went back into Gaza, just like in the early part of the war, October, November. And the 5 divisions didn't do anything. They didn't take a lot of land. They didn't take a lot of neighborhoods. They demolished a lot of stuff that was already in their sector. I mean, they had to push into this buffer zone. And then they kind of didn't seem to do much. So the question was, after now we're in June, we're at the end of June. So it's a whole month and a half of conflict almost. It's not clear what Gideons Chariots is. It's different than 2024 because the IDF hasn't left anywhere, but it also hasn't gone forward. So it looks like a grinding war of attrition, like the First World War. Casualties, some people would say, well, casualties are relatively low. Casualties are lower than in 2024, but that doesn't mean that there are no casualties. First of all, people suffer because they don't have home life. They suffer economically. They suffer from post-trauma, and they also get wounded and they die. And it's a question is, well, what are those deaths achieving? Hostages are not coming home. There are still 50 of them there. There are some bodies have been recovered, but the living ones are not coming home, and that's the ones that you should have a priority for. And so that leads to deep questions about what exactly this Gideon's Chariot is and where it goes and why it's not as decisive as the story was painted.
What do you make of Witkoff's last proposal, in which he actually intermixed living and deceased hostages, at least in phase 1? I believe it was 10 living and 18 deceased. Personally, I thought it was wild. I don't understand how you have any bodies come out before living hostages, if that's going to be a negotiating tactic. But I simply don't understand it. But perhaps you have a different take or have a deeper understanding of exactly what Wickoff is trying to do here?
Well, the original proposal, we're talking about a proposal that goes back to early 2024, which then Witkoff was able to kind of get part of that proposal through the end zone in January, 2 days before the Trump inauguration, which was a multi-phase proposal in which all the women come out and a bunch of the people that are considered humanitarian cases, elderly people or people like Mengistu and Said, who were held for 10 years, obviously humanitarian case. They should never have been there for 10 years. So, and then, of course, you have a mix of younger males, soldiers living and dead, and civilians living and dead, who are all considered young. From Hamas' point of view, every young male is obviously just a soldier. I assume that's how they kind of see it. So we talk about civilians captured at Nova who were age 24. Hamas says, okay, but that's basically a soldier, not So look, I mean, any deal, as you said, should value human life first. The idea of getting a bunch of corpses and trading them is bizarre. I think that the Witkoff thing was, you have to deal with the art of the possible, which is what Hamas and Qatar were saying, or Cairo, was they want the war to end. A. B. They want to guarantee it will end, which is probably American guarantee. And C. Therefore, they want to hold on to a few living people until the end because they understand that if they just hold bodies, Israel eventually might just say, okay, we're fine, the war can end, we'll just leave the bodies there. It's not ideal, but the Israel already left Hadar Golden and on Shaul in Gaza since 2014. Israel has a bad track record when it comes to leaving people, unfortunately, in Gaza. And
Deceased. Oh, actually living also. Huh.
Shaul and Golden were deceased and dead, two IDF soldiers, and Mengistu and Said were living people. But the case of them was they had both gone into Gaza of their own accord. So people would say, well, it's a strange case. But how can you leave living people there for 10 years? It's unconscionable. But look, I mean, in the end of the day, there are other missing people in IDF. There are missing soldiers from the Sultan Yaqub battle right in 82 that are still in Syria. I mean, is there one or two are still missing? The Ron Arad is still missing, right? So, it's not always a magic wand to get bodies back. Obviously, to get living people back is the number one thing. But the Hamas is not entire. They understand that if they give up all the living people, then Israel won't end the war. And Israel has openly said, we won't end the war. Now, Israel's leadership could change that tune and just say, okay, fine, we'll end the war. Give us all the living people back. And we'll allow Trump to guarantee it, along with the Qataris in Cairo. Israel could choose that path if Israel wanted to prioritize those people first. The narrative is, well, we can't do that because it would hurt our security, like the Gilad Shalit deal or something. Well, okay, then Israel could choose just to go to the end zone and just obliterate Hamas and hope they get a few hostages out and then and finish this thing. But instead, what we get is the worst of both worlds, which is hostages stuck there forever, and the war goes on forever, which in my mind, I don't understand why you'd ever choose the worst of both worlds. So the Witkoff deal is some way to say, okay, let's bridge this weird problem we have of the worst of two worlds. Let's get a few living people out, a few dead people out, and keep moving forward bit by bit. It's better to get them out. Let's remember, if the Witkoff deal, the bridging deal, had come into fruition on March 2nd, we'd already have another 10 or 15 live people out. Instead, the decision was to not have that happen and to go back to war since March 2nd and not achieve any hostages coming out except for Ed and Alexander and not defeat
And
Hamas.
a few, yeah, right, and a few deceased hostages, right?
Yes, that's right. They've recovered several, I think 5 or 6 deceased people, and that's great. But again, it's a depressing, sad trickle, and it does not. And I think it's preferable to end wars and win them decisively.
Do
I
you
don't.
think there's any do you think there's any hope for serious change right now, or do you think that there's a chance we could be sitting here talking on June 24th, 2026, and it'd be the same situation?
I mean, look, you could be optimistic and you could say Israel feels that it's won the war against Iran. At least Netanyahu's government, parts of it feel they've won. There's going to be, of course, critics that say no, we didn't get there, but whatever. Let's say the optimistic view. Israel feels it won. The leadership feels they won. Netanyahu feels, along with his people and his the party, this is the winner for the election. We beat the Iranians. Now we can make concessions in Gaza, because we can say, okay, we left Hamas in charge. Hamas doesn't matter. We beat the big octopus. So then it means they're flexible, as opposed to before defeating the Iranians, it would look bad for the government, because they would have lost to Hamas and lost to the Iranians. Not great. So you could say that's the optimistic viewpoint. The win in Iran creates flexibility, creates opportunity. And Qatar is there to help, because Qatar brokered the deal with the Iranians and helped the Trump administration. Trump is very happy. And Trump says, okay, now do the deal for this. Maybe it works. The pessimistic view would be the government is so pleased with itself having won and defeated the Iranians that now it looks back at Gaza and either doesn't care or thinks that it can win in Gaza, but yet tries more of the same of what's happened with Gideons Chariots, which is so far has not produced the win. And then we get more of the same. And then we do end up talking about this for another year. So it's hard to say where this goes.
What's your take on internal politics? I know Ambassador Mike Huckabee got involved when it came to not having the coalition collapse. Do you think that now that there's a ceasefire with Iran, that these kinds of things will be back on the table? What should we look for next steps when it comes to governing coalition and Netanyahu?
Yeah, I mean, Huckabee was accused of getting involved to keep the Haredi parties in the government. Now, you could argue in retrospect, having the fact the Iran thing attack happened, that, well, look, that was important because they couldn't have the government collapsing while the fighter planes are flying out of Nevatim or wherever they lifted off from. That would be a total bizarre disaster. So you could say that. I mean, look, now the government, you would think the coalition would stay together now, having, being able to say we beat the Iranians, the coalition can stay together. The big thing, though, of course, is always, what about the Haredi conscription? And no one in Israel understands that, because how is it plausible that in the worst, longest war in Israel's history, in which people in the army are being called up forever and again, and it's a massive, huge burden on people's lives, in which the Israeli people, Jewish people, are very resilient, but resilience only goes so far after years of war. How is it plausible that the Haredim men all seem to dodge the draft? I mean, it doesn't make any sense in a wartime situation to allow that, and I think a lot of people understand that. So the win of the Iran war, which certainly helps the coalition, even though it's cynical to always see these conflicts in light of politics, it would be preferable if they were not. It would be preferable if the conflict just happens and then the politicians just kind of go away, the way Churchill left office in 1945, having won and, okay, fine, I did a good job, now go home. Unfortunately, that's not the case, but I assume the coalition survives then for a little bit of time. Maybe the coalition, as I said, maybe it thinks it can get street cred from this for the elections, and then it says, okay, let's bite the bullet and do elections then. But the end of the day, the Damocles sword that sits over Israel of the Haredi enlistment is always going to be a problem. Having 100,000 men or whatever refusing to do army service at a time when the country needs them is just not really great. And again, they should do some
Army service, or even some sort of civil
something.
service that would contribute to the betterment of that society.
It's insane. I mean, imagine reading about the Vietnam War, the Second World War, and finding out that, American Presbyterians, like some large sect, I'm not going to say Quakers, because there are American conscious objectors in Vietnam or the Civil War, but they're like tiny little sects. I'm talking about a big American Christian sect. Like, let's say you read about the Second World War. Well, Baptists just don't go to the army. A third of the country. You'd say that's insane. I mean, if you read about it and they said, in the Russian Empire,
it's completely nonsensical.
In
And
the
they get
Russian
handouts.
Empire, the Orthodox men, Greek Orthodox men, did not go to the army. Well, that's half the country. No, it's insane. So obviously in Israel, that this has been allowed to grow. Like any situation where you allow a bad thing to fester, just like in Europe, they have issues with migration or whatever. Whenever you allow something to become too big, it becomes too big to fail, and then you can't get rid of it. And the Haredim, the inability to get them just to do something, some kind of service, it seems to be a gap that is unbridgeable in Israeli society. And I have no idea. I don't see a recipe for how that ever changes. I don't believe that it will change, but we'll see.
I think, you know, the argument that I've made to some people on the inside personally was simply just saying, take the Jewish aspect out of it, of the Jew of Israel for 1 second, and just say you're living in a country and you have certain demands on the economy, you have certain demands on the military, and if the country needs those things, it's important that the individuals that can help participate to defend the borders and to defend and to help support the economy in a proactive manner. And there's no other country in the world that would allow, like you said, this huge segment to just avoid it. So I'm trying to say, not even from a is Torah important, is Torah not important? That's not even really the discussion. It's just saying, in what world are you allowed to just ignore basic responsibilities of defense? Um,
I mean,
yeah,
historically, when you have nations in which people don't want to defend their countries, they don't do well long term. I mean, the Italian city states used to rely on mercenaries in the 15th century. I didn't think it went. I don't think it went very well. You have other cases like the Roman Empire, the late Empire, I guess, when they just hired a bunch of people like from the borders of the empire to do the fighting, and eventually they hired what they call barbarians to do it. But well, obviously we know it didn't work out for them. So, Israel's obviously a totally different case, and Israel's a unique country in terms of having national service anyway, because a lot of countries don't. But allowing a huge segment of and in this case, the Jewish population, i.e., it's a Jewish state and they're Jewish, is strange because it's one thing to exempt the Arabs, and you say, okay, maybe in other countries you'd have examples of that where you have a group of people that are a national minority who are seen as whatever outside the what have you consensus, and so you don't force them all to go to the army, okay, because it's in a sense not their country, whatever. But it's bizarre to have people at the very center of the thing not serving. So
I remember I was visiting a bereaved family, um, Bedouin, who had lost their son on October 7th. And I just remember getting in the car with my family after and trying to, like, people outside of Israel would have no concept of the visit we just made, especially in light of the fight over Haredi draft law. I'm like, this family has Golani flags flying, Israeli flags, letters from the prime minister, letters from the president. They're so proud and that their son was on the front lines and unfortunately gave his life. But the movement, the nationals, then you have a segment of the Jewish people, the Jewish state that say, no, we're not going to participate. It's something that I don't think that the average person would be able to understand unless they really saw it with their own eyes. It's quite something. Seth, before I let you go here, do you think that this moment of unity where we see Yair Lapid and others who were very much locking horns with Netanyahu, and they kind of came together behind this Iran mission, do you think it lasts more than the next 6 hours, or do you think that those we're quickly back to where we were before this Iran attack?
I think it'll last for a short period of time, but I think it depends on if that ceasefire holds. But at the end of the day, it also depends on Netanyahu and his behavior. I mean, there is a tendency in the camp on the right or the far right to create crises sometimes, to refer to the other as the capitalists or the deep state or whatever. So both sides have a role to play in that, whether there's national consensus. I think that if I recall correctly, Menachem Begin was brought into the government in '67 as a minister without portfolio, despite the fact that obviously he was much disliked and, to extent hated by the labor Zionists. But after that, obviously, he went back into opposition, right? I mean, and he was not liked. I mean, he was never liked by those people on the left, or that did not like his brand of politics. So, Israel's a divided society, like every society, every democratic society. And that's the way it works. That can be healthy for democracy, but it can also be very unhealthy, especially if it's we see what's happened in Israel, where hostage families that get death threats, and then things like that. Even former hostages have been attacked online and things, so that's just awful, so Israel has to bridge that gap. But Israel has a lot of national solidarity when it comes to basic things like fighting the Iranians. is a basic sine qua non. So, and that's good. But politics is politics, and things will. I assume they'll go back to that not so long, depending on how both sides behave, and depending on the behavior of Israel's enemies.
Seth, I really appreciate you taking the time here, and I will put links to your writing in the show notes so people can check it out. Seth Frantzman, very, very brilliant thinker on everything having to do with Israel and the Middle East. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.